welcome to KAUST Live. We're coming to you from the Fall Enrichment Program. This year's theme is marine biodiversity. Here to speak to us about that is marine scientist Greg Skomal. Greg, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be here.
So you research sharks in the northern Atlantic. Talk to us a little bit about your work, what you've learned about shark populations in that area.
Well, the work I've been doing spans a long period of time, and it's shifted from species to species over the years. And what we're trying to do is collect the kinds of information that leads to sound management, fisheries management, conservation, sustainability of shark populations. So my early work with sharks was really focused on natural history. I was interested in growth rates, reproductive biology, feeding ecology. I've kind of shifted over the course of the last couple of decades more toward movement ecology. What are these animals doing in three-dimensional space over time at multiple scales? And so a lot of our work, particularly the last dozen years, has been really focused on white sharks in particular, great white sharks off the coast of Cape Cod, and what they're doing in time and space. How
do you track their movements? How do you surveil them? How does that happen?
Well, you know what? The real cool part of my job is getting out there and being able to place all kinds of sophisticated kinds of technology on these sharks. You know, when I first started doing this a long time ago, this technology didn't exist. Now we've got tags that are linked to satellites, linked to acoustic receivers. So what we do is we basically spy on these fish by using various kinds of technology. And they tell us what these animals are doing, and at scales that we never dreamed of.
So you get out there sometimes and actually stick a GoPro in the water and get up and close with these sharks. How did that evolve? Like, how did you get to the point where you thought, I'm going to stand on the front of a boat and get within a couple of feet of one of these guys?
Well, what we used to do is hold grad students by the feet, and they'd hold a camera, and they'd put that in the water and try to follow the shark. But we started going through too many grad students, and this really cool gadget called a GoPro came out. And that didn't exist when I was a kid. So it was like the ultimate tool. And the first thing we do when we come up on a shark is we're trying to figure out who that shark is. And what's really neat about white sharks is they have individual patterns, like fingerprints in their coloration, in their fin shapes, sometimes in fin deformities, and we're able to tell them apart. So the first thing I do is get a few clips of GoPro footage to determine who that is. Is it a male? Is it a female? And if the shark continues to cooperate, we'll try to place a tag in it. And what we use is a small intramuscular dart that goes at the base of the dorsal fin. And what that shark has to be doing is swimming right up near the surface, so I can place that using a long tagging pole and an applicator needle. So a lot needs to happen for that to be successful. But I'll be honest with you, when I was a kid, I dreamed about being able to work with these fish, and now to be on the end of a pulpit staring down at a 2,000-pound white shark is really an amazing experience.
Yeah, you come up with really quirky names. You were tweeting about Sean at some point, having seen him. How do you come up with the names? Is this just a random, is there a process? How is that done?
Well, if you told me 10 years ago I'd be naming fish, I would think you're crazy, because I'm kind of a classically trained fisheries biologist. I don't make fish my pets. But one of the things we learned early on in this job of working with big charismatic sharks like white sharks is if you start giving them names, people start spending money. So we actually allow sponsors to name the fish. So the really bad names come from sponsors. The good names sometimes come from me, and they might be named after a war veteran, or they might be named after an old friend who's passed. And some of them are just simply to describe the shark, Scratchy. Scratches on its nose. So, the names are kind of weird, but they work.
How many sharks are we talking about? I mean, are there thousands of these guys? Are there hundreds? What is that population size?
Well, the main vector of our work right now, and has been for the last 4 years, has been to actually come up with a population estimate. And now we're dealing with an open system, which is very complex in terms of trying to count the numbers. I can give you the raw data and say that we've cataloged almost 400 individual white sharks over the course of the last 4 summers. But what we're going to do in the coming months is I've got a brilliant student who's working on this. She's going to take those raw numbers and turn it into a population size. And I suspect it's on the order of thousands.
Wow. Did you start with sharks, or did you go to large fish in general and then sharks became a focal point?
Well, I love working with all kinds of big fish, but one of the things, I really love coral reefs too. So I figured when I was at the University of Rhode Island that I would probably go into coral reef ecology, and I set myself to do some work abroad on coral reefs. And then this job opportunity came up with sharks. I actually thought we knew everything there is to know about sharks, so there's no way I was going to get a job doing this. And so for those folks out there who think we know a lot about sharks, we're actually just scratching the surface. So I encourage people to go into this field and to do this. So I started with sharks as a technician in a laboratory working for the US government. But I branched out into tunas, and I really like billfish. If it's a big fish and it goes great distances, it's a really cool animal as far as I'm concerned.
Right. So these are, would you consider them then alpha predators, or at the top of the food chain? Talk a little bit about their place in the ecosystem that you're studying.
Yeah, I mean, we really refer to these animals in general, and I hate generalizations, but when we look at them, it's basically they're the top predators. They're apex predators. They're really critically important in terms of ecosystem balance. Whether you're dealing with coral reef ecosystems or the open ocean ecosystem, you take away these top predators, you get what we call top-down effects that could disrupt the equilibrium of those ecosystems. So it's important that we preserve them and conserve them at sustainable levels. The problem is it's really hard to do because these are what we really refer to as highly migratory animals. So they don't stop at international borders. And so typically, for example, like a blue shark is an animal that traverses the entire North Atlantic Ocean. And when you've got that, you've got an animal that's exploited by dozens of countries. I think 52 countries exploit blue sharks. So when we talk about sustainability and conservation, we talk about sitting at the table with all those countries and trying to divide up what's likely a very small pie. So there's great complexity involved in that. So knowing where these animals are going in time and spaces is critically important to getting to that stage.
Yeah. You had an encounter, which I'm sure is not entirely unique for your line of work, with a shark that became a bit of a meme online and in mass media. I'm curious, do you think that mass media and the Shark Week effect and everything else, is that a net positive or a net negative?
I think it's a net positive. I think that the explosion of social media and the way we communicate these days, yeah, you're going to get those outlets that still demonize sharks, and Hollywood's a good example of that. But I think a lot of people are embracing these animals now than they did when I first started doing this. I've seen an evolution of attitudes that has been really, I think, really refreshing to see. In the days when I was first interested in sharks, the thinking that the only good shark was a dead shark was pervasive. And I think now with the fact that researchers and conservation groups are getting the word out through social media outlets and a lot of other vectors is really helping to change public attitudes. And so, yeah, we're going to always have those quirky Hollywood films that show giant sharks eating boats, which I find kind of entertaining, but I don't think anyone takes those so much seriously anymore.
Yeah. You're speaking at 12:30, and your talk is about the secret life of Jaws. What is secret? What is the stuff that we don't know about sharks?
Well, basically, what I'm gonna explore in this talk is that aspect of sharks, and I'll use the white shark as the prime example, but I'll allude to some others and show some other data as well. What we don't realize is that these sharks spend such a small proportion of time where we can see them, where we can observe them, when we can study what they're doing. The bulk of their time, at least 50–60% of their time, is below the surface, and sometimes at great depths, depths in excess of 200 meters, where we absolutely do not know what they're doing. So how do you answer that question? How do you figure out what these animals are doing? It's like studying, these deep water reefs. How do you do that? What are the tools available to us? So I'm going to go down the road of exploring these new technologies that we're using now to try to figure out that aspect of the lives of sharks so they can hopefully tell us some of these secrets.
Yeah. In your observation, what's the personality that you've seen? I think maybe one aspect that's overemphasized, like you said, is the predation aspect of these animals. What other things do they do that people might be surprised about?
Well, you know, there's a great line from the movie Jaws, and I suspect a lot of people have seen that, where the scientist in the film, Matt Hooper, says, all these sharks do is eat and make baby sharks. And that's kind of true to some extent. You know, they're driven by those two factors, getting big by eating and then reproducing. So the reproductive aspect of their lives is really something we know very, very little about. You know, very rarely do we ever observe when sharks mate, how do they mate, where does this occur, when does this occur, and gestation periods, where do they give birth to their young. These aspects really remain another part of their secret lives. And so, yeah, we could study their foraging ecology using direct and indirect methods, and we can observe some of this foraging in shallow waters. But their whole reproductive element is something we attack indirectly, and it's really frustrating because there's so much yet we need to know. And we tend to focus also on these big, these charismatic animals like white sharks and threshers and blue sharks and makos and all the species I've worked on and been fortunate to work on. But there's over 500 species of sharks, and some of which we know virtually nothing about. We're even having trouble classifying them at this stage, particularly some of these deep water sharks. And those too are being exploited and perhaps at unsustainable levels. So, there's a lot left to be done, and I can't do it all, that's for sure.
Right.
So I'm trying to recruit people to help.
What risks, what challenges do sharks face, particularly because of humans? We were talking before we started on air that you were saying that actually sharks have moved back into some areas where you're researching. That seems like a positive sign. Is it?
Yeah, one of the things I'll talk about today is the reestablishment, the recolonization of white sharks and seals and this natural predator-prey relationship off the east coast of the United States, particularly off New England. And that's a conservation success story. But even that's got its problems because the more seals, the more sharks, the more interactions with humans. We've had shark attacks and bites. That's creating political issues. So even with conservation comes problems. But the white shark's a great example of success on the east coast of the U.S., but we have populations throughout the world that are being driven to the brink of eradication because of overfishing. Overfishing is by far the worst problem that sharks are facing globally, and it's a complex issue because, again, over 500 species, many of which are being exploited at levels that we don't even understand or know. We're not even quantifying levels of mortality in certain areas, and each one of these species has separate populations around the world. So it's a complex issue. And on top of that, we get habitat degradation issues in nearshore areas which sharks are utilizing as nursery habitat, and we have ocean plastics and all these other issues. So it's an uphill battle at this stage, and just getting developing and well-developed countries to start thinking about shark conservation has been a challenge, but it's coming slowly.
Particularly for the eastern seaboard and the U.S., it's a highly populated area. So what do you do? What is the policy when people and sharks start interacting on a more regular basis? What's done, and what are you seeing through your research?
Well, we know from other parts of the world, certainly where you have sharks, their prey, and then humans encroaching upon that kill zone, that you get problems. And these problems can lead to extreme measures such as shark netting, shark eradication programs. And, we're trying to avoid that. And so it's delicate. It's a delicate situation because these events where somebody does get bitten by a shark and it's so severe that it actually kills them, which happened just a couple of months ago off Cape Cod. They're devastating to a community, they're tragic events, and I feel for them. But the knee-jerk reaction that can come from this will be, well, we've got to get rid of the seals, we got to get rid of the sharks, or we got to do both. Or we've got to start setting up nets, we got to figure out some way to deal with it, and there's no silver bullet. I wish I could say that, yeah, okay, we'll just call in this magic and solve this problem. But there are other areas like Australia and like South Africa that have been dealing with shark attack. And in some cases, in California, they've certainly started to adapting to it and coexisting. But it really does require a change in human behavior. But that's hard to come. That's hard to motivate.
I'm imagining you jumping in a boat and literally shooing the sharks away from the shore. I mean, what's the alternative path?
Well, I'd fail miserably if I tried that. I think even if even if you wanted to try to eradicate these animals, that would be very difficult to do. There's personal protection devices that people use, shark shield, other kinds of technology that generate electrical fields or magnets. And, I think those are feel-good measures. In some cases, they work to some extent. Certainly setting up netting has afforded the public some level of protection. I think it's smoke and mirrors for the most part, because there's no real easy solution to this. The solution is really, what people don't want to hear. If don't go out in the water 100 meters from shore in 5 meters of water and swim around and act like a seal. But people, for some reason, still want to do that.
There's no bear spray equivalent for sharks, I'm guessing.
No, I mean, there have been chemicals that have been devised, but I can't see them working. Typically when sharks attack, they do it with stealth and speed. So the ability to actually pull out a weapon that sprays these sharks before they attack you is just not feasible.
Or the other one, which I've heard on the internets in general, is that you're supposed to hit them in the nose, which I feel like is a bit of a last minute measure.
Well, that's when the shark's already got you.
Right.
Really. People say to me, does hitting them in the nose work? And I think that if a shark does have you, just hit them anywhere you possibly can. And that's what the seals do. And many of the white sharks that we see have incredible scars and scratch marks from the seals themselves. And I think it does cause the sharks to release them. But at that stage, the amount of damage done by that bite is traumatic and likely fatal.
Right. Talk a bit about the research that you're doing now. What's kind of the latest and greatest in shark research right now?
Well, a lot of scientists are, because of the pressing issues associated with overexploitation of populations globally, research has gone down the road of just trying to quantify that, trying to get a sense of time series data of landings so we can start looking at where populations are going. But we're also doing a lot of backpedaling when it comes to natural history. We want to get information on growth rates and reproductive rates, so we can look at intrinsic rates of replacement, which are critically important. You need to know how often a shark replaces itself in order to be able to look at sustainable levels of exploitation. And you need to know where they are in three-dimensional space over time. What's their critical habitat, what jurisdictions do they travel into, and how vulnerable are they? So a lot of my work personally still does, to some extent, look at natural history with various projects we've got going on, but I'm really engaged now in this movement work, and I really do love the new tools that are available to us. So not only are we looking at white sharks and their population numbers, but we're looking at their fine-scale behavior around these aggregation area, Cape Cod, as well as where are they going when they leave Cape Cod. But we're also doing work with thresher sharks as far as their broader scale movement patterns, their population size, and we're looking at a variety of other species, from porbeagles to makos to blue sharks, that are ongoing projects with various students to get a sense, to just try to collect these data that'll be useful for management.
Yeah. Tell us something surprising or something that most people don't know about sharks.
Well, I'm going to show in my talk, in particular, this graphic of white shark behavior and what drove me to trying to figure out what these animals are doing at depth, And what was really surprising to me, not the fact that some of the white sharks we tag in Cape Cod travel out into the open ocean, because that's been demonstrated for white sharks in other parts of the world. But they have much more of a nomadic journey around the North Atlantic. They don't seem to go to any particular focal area, almost like they're on some kind of a walkabout where they're just wandering. And I know they're not doing that because when wandering costs energy. And no animal wants to blow energy just for the fun of seeing the mid-Atlantic ridge. So these critters are wandering around the Atlantic, but what's really fascinating is they're diving down to depths as great as 1,000+ meters every day through an incredibly broad temperature range. And so that drives me to think, why? Why are they, everybody here is wondering, why do they do this? What's motivating them? Because again, it costs energy to do that. And so that was surprising to me to see this nomadic journey by some of these sharks, not all of them. A lot of the sharks have a very simple north-south migratory pattern along the eastern seaboard, but these deep diving behavior, what's driving that? Is it, and it's gonna be something to eat, some predictable food resource, or some reproductive component. So the scientific community now is all going back and forth, and they're screaming at each other because some think they're reproducing out there and others think they're feeding, and nobody has a clue, which I think is the funniest part.
Is there a major difference between what you would see in the Pacific and what you see in the Atlantic?
Yeah, on the Pacific coast, almost all subadults and adults, white sharks, once they're, they have a coastal phase in their aggregation areas, being California as well as off Guadalupe, Mexico. But at some stage, almost predictably, seasonally, they'll move into this offshore habitat, which is, again, an area of great debate. It's referred to as the White Shark Cafe. It's about the size of Texas. But it's a focal area, if you will, that all these sharks go to. And there's one laboratory that firmly believes that these are subadults and adults that are migrating there to breed. And there's others that firmly believe they're migrating there because there's some food resource. But it's far more focal than it is in the Atlantic Ocean, where they're just kind of wandering and going as far as the Azores. With no kind of pattern. And what scientists get frustrated by is lack of pattern, But animals don't have to adhere to patterns, and we're always looking for them, and we don't find them, and it frustrates us. But the patterns may emerge over broader scales in time, and we're so darn impatient, and that's a problem.
How long has shark research been happening? I mean, like, what's the data that we have? How far back does it go?
Oh, hundreds of years, really. I mean, people have been interested in these animals. I mean, it was rudimentary, but just recording where and when you see a particular kind of shark or describing that shark, constitutes some aspect of research, and then that goes back hundreds of years. We're constantly reclassifying these animals as we learn more and we develop new molecular techniques. But what I thought, as a younger person, decades ago, I was thinking that the threat of shark attack, drove scientists, particularly in the 50s and 60s, to do a lot of intense research on sharks. So I figured at that time, so much had been done, we know all there is to know. And yeah, we knew a lot about sharks, but almost all of that research was centered on why they bite people. And this was work largely carried out by the military. They wanted to find out why sharks were motivated to bite people, and they wanted to protect soldiers. And I understand that. What we didn't know is some of the basic, nuts and bolts kinds of research questions that needed to be answered. The how long they live, those aspects of it. What's their growth rate? Sex-specific behaviors, those kinds of things. Nobody knew much about. So we started, at least in the United States, we started exploiting sharks at very high levels in the 1980s into the 1990s. And we were doing a lot of backpedaling because we were not prepared to manage them. And we didn't have the data we needed in order to sustainably develop management protocols and regulations. And so a lot of the early data that came out, we're finding out is absolutely wrong because we did it too fast, we did it wrong.
I was waiting for you to say that there was a secret program to weaponize, after you mentioned the military, to weaponize sharks, which would be amazing and probably a new movie idea. Has that ever happened? Outside of the will it bite a soldier?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of, but I'm sure there's been a film or two made. I understand sharks travel in tornadoes. I saw a film about that. And I actually got asked a question by the Weather Channel, which is a big channel, about whether that was possible.
Right.
I didn't respond, but I had to think that one over. but I want to expose myself to that kind of negative press. But yeah, that was an entertaining film, but they don't typically do that.
Greg Skomal predicts AI-powered Robo sharks, basically.
Yeah. There have been Robo sharks.
Okay.
They're fairly primitive, but animatronic sharks are, there's been some discussion of doing that, having them swim with real sharks with camera systems in them. I think it's a really cool idea.
Yeah.
And my guess that Shark Week will do it at some point, because if there's any channel that's going to go down that road, it's probably Discovery. So
right.
I suspect I'll be called in to look at that, and I'll
So that
walk away.
that seems like a big operation. I mean, you've been involved in Shark Week, and that's been kind of an ongoing thing. I mean, how big of an operation is that, and how many episodes have you filmed with them?
Yeah, I mean, the Shark Week stuff I do it's interesting, because I have colleagues who I've known for decades who say they'll never do a Shark Week show, and then of course they get asked and they do one, but. And some actually stick to it and say we're never going to do a Shark Week show, and I've been doing quite a few in recent years, because I happen to believe that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And Shark Week has problems. It has problems dating back 30 years, but I think that they've morphed in recent years. And if I can add just one scintilla of science to a film, where you get some kid watching that and say, hey, that's pretty cool, I think these animals are cool, and I might want to do that someday, or we need to protect them, then I think it's worth participating in that film. So what a lot of people don't realize is Discovery Communications, Discovery Channel entertains all kinds of proposals from dozens of production companies, and production companies have all kinds of ideas. Most of them are completely unrealistic, and others are realistic. And I work with 3 or 4 production companies consistently that when they come to me and they say, what about this idea? I help them flesh it out. We pitch it to Discovery, and they either fund it or they don't. And so in recent years, they've funded quite a few of them. And as I said, I'm just trying to get a little bit of science in there. Right. And what's really nice about some of our AUV tracking work, where we're using an underwater vehicle to track the sharks, almost all of that has been exclusively funded by Discovery Channel. And that's on the order of millions of dollars. So they are putting their money up, and they are super interested in shark conservation. There's been a big push on that in recent years. And they're interested in the science much more than they were, say, 5-10 years ago.
I'll ask one more question, then we'll turn it over to our audience. I've seen quite a bit of activity online with people swimming with sharks and seemingly advocating for sharks. How smart is it to grab your GoPro and dive in the water and swim with some of these larger sharks?
It depends where and when. I mean, and who. That's what it really boils down to. I've been in the water with a lot of different species of sharks. 99% of them are benign animals that are really wonderful to swim with. They're wonderful to photograph, and those photographs can be used to educate a broader audience who will never get in the water with sharks. So I'm a big advocate for jumping in the water with sharks. I think it's the best way to see them. The first 10 years of my career, most of the sharks I saw were dead. And I learned a lot from dead sharks, but I'll be honest with you, they're not as attractive as one that's swimming right by you. So I'm really big into that. There are areas that I will not swim with sharks without a protective cage. And so it's just a matter of knowing when those times are and what those sharks are. And that's what it's all about. And going with a bona fide, credible, operation, if you're going to do ecotourism, that does it right.
Very good. So do we have some questions from our audience?
I finally answered them all. It's taken me 30-something years of doing this.
Yeah. You ready?
You mentioned that with these sharks swimming in the deep depths, there's new technology that has come out and new methods of tracking them or monitoring what they're doing. What kind of technology are you using?
Well, it'll be the focus of the talk I give at 12:30, and it's basically going to be AUV technology that can go to great depths and record their behavior.
Thank you.
And for those who don't know, AUV is an autonomous underwater vehicle, so think of it as a drone or a robot goes underwater and follows sharks.
So you can follow them. That's how you know they go to these depths, I guess.
Well, the tags tell us, you know, a lot about where they go, but they tell us nothing about what they're doing, actually doing, the behavior of these animals. So what we're doing is adding a component that'll allow us to actually see what these sharks are doing.
Can you put a GoPro on a shark? Is that a
You could do
feasible
that. You could do that. You got to get it back, and that's a bit of a challenge. And you can only get one view of it, and you got to keep it on. I mean, so there's a lot of challenges to putting camera systems. It's been done. We've used camera systems on sharks, but getting them back, particularly if a shark moves thousands of kilometers away, is a super big challenge.
Any further questions here in the back? It seems like GoPro would probably be interested in sponsoring that. It seems like it fits in the extreme
We've tried.
sports arena.
No pressure on GoPro right now, but we've tried.
Yeah, please.
All right, so you mentioned that overfishing was the biggest threat to sharks. What are some of the best ways to protect sharks from that threat?
I mean, it really comes from management at the state level. So, you know, it's sitting down at the bargaining table, and we have international treaties for every ocean. In the Atlantic, we have a treaty called ICAT, International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas. They meet once a year. They have a scientific body that's composed of countries. 54 countries participate in this treaty. So it's developing countries and developed countries. And they sit down at the table with the best available science, and they decide how they're going to divide up that particular pie. So whether it's blue sharks or makos or swordfish or bluefin tuna, whatever. So that's how it's going to happen. So we need individual countries to agree at the international table to adhere to strict regulations and caps and limits, and then they have to go home and they have to make sure that their fishing fleets are doing that. That's how it gets done. It's really the best way to do it. And then there's enforcement issues, which will be a problem forever. But we found that when a country really decides, the Bahamas is a great example. They've decided to not allow the harvest of any sharks. So they've established a shark sanctuary in the Bahamas, and they've determined that sharks are far more valuable to them from a diving and photographic perspective than an ecotourism perspective than it is to kill them. And so they've gone ahead and implement that, they enforce it, and they do it. Other countries, the US has a very strict management regime, the European countries, and it's a matter of getting to some of these developing countries and asking them to do the same thing and helping them do it. You know, spending money to help them do it, to collect the data they need, to then implement management protocols.
These reserves are effective, but they're pretty rare. And if there's still
That's
a
right.
demand for shark meat, like illegal fishing is still going to occur. Do you think that a change on a more basic level, like changing people's mind about eating shark, would have a bigger impact than management?
I think that there are areas where shark is a protein source and needs to be harvested. And I've been to a couple of these areas where they're harvested every day. The fins go to the Asian markets, and the meat is consumed locally. So there is a way to harvest sharks. I'm not saying, and I think the Bahamas is an extreme. I don't believe that we should shut down shark fishing. I think we should harvest at sustainable levels. They may be very low, but we need to harvest at sustainable levels. And so for some species it's possible, for other species it's simply not. But markets, over a broader scale, the Asian fin market is driving a lot of the illegal fishing that's going on. So you make a good point. You do have to hit those markets and hit public attitudes where these markets occur and change that. So you reduce the demand, or at least shift those markets to only buying from sustainable fisheries. And that would be a huge step forward, and that's something that I really promote. If we can get Hong Kong, for example, to just buy fins from fishing nations that harvest at sustainable levels, then you can eradicate the illegal fin trade, which really needs to be quantified as well. But those are that's excellent approaches.
So I feel there's a lot of fear associated with the sharks, and a lot of fear from people who have never seen them. And I mean, you wouldn't go into the safari for lions and be, you know, you're going to feel the fear, but people want to protect the lions. But how do we change the fear into this emotional response of we want to protect the sharks as well? How do you feel we're going to change people's mind to make them love and want to protect sharks?
Well, I think it's been going on. And I think social media and the internet and good responsible filmmaking is doing that. And the way you do it is you take the research done by scientists and you translate it into something that the public is fascinated by. And that's important. All too often the scientific community tends to enclose themselves, at least historically, and do their research and publish it in papers that nobody reads, you know, except other scientists. Now what I think is happening is really good research is being, you know, consumed by the public because it's being translated into fascinating accounts of these animals. So if you tell people, you know, about the behavior of white sharks, is not simply going around trying to, you know, bite people, but this is how they really live, you know, how many young they have, you know, when they give birth, where they give birth, you know, lack of parental care, all these kinds of aspects of it. What you do is you capture the fascination of people, and once you've done that, and this is basically the equation you use, you capture their fascination, and then you get their respect, and then they say, well, why are we killing them? You know, why are we killing them? And you start changing that. That's what you've got to do. And I think that there are steps being taken now, over the last decade in particular, that more and more people, I mean, many of you here are fascinated by these animals and you want to protect them, and because you've learned about them, you know. But if all you do is watch television and see Sharknado, you may say, well, we got to get rid of these things. So you've got to be willing to learn.
I think we had a question in the back here. Yeah. We can pass it. You don't have to throw it. Thank you.
So are there any genetic maps or genome sequencing for the white shark so you can adapt it or better understanding the behavior of this animal?
Yeah, I mean, that's not an area of my expertise, but one of the things we do is when we will take biopsies from our free-swimming sharks, and if we're studying, for example, the blue shark, we might capture the animal, but we'll try to take muscle biopsies, and then I share them with the Florida Museum of Natural History's shark unit, which is Dr. Gavin Naylor, does quite a bit of genomic work, and I let him play with that aspect of it. And I'm not sure he's done the genome yet with the white shark, but he's looking for an incredibly fresh. So he's directed me to get a good fresh tissue sample, get it into liquid nitrogen, and get it to him, because he wants to go down that road, which will then lead to perhaps studying some of these aspects of their physiology and perhaps behavior from a molecular level. But it's a great avenue to go down. And I'm too old to understand those things. But I go to the experts, and I think one of the things that I've done in my own career over the last 30-something years is I love to collaborate with real experts, you know, and I think that's important. And share, you know, tissue samples, whatever we can collect with them, and have them fulfill what they're trying to do, so we can maximize what we learn about this species using multiple disciplines. Good question.
Excuse me, do you have some studies or data about sharks on the Red Sea, especially in particular in Saudi Arabia?
Yes, I was really fortunate to work with the Red Sea Research Center here in 2009 to 2012 on whale sharks down off Ali. And that was wonderful, because I got to visit KAUST and visit the Red Sea and dive my heart out with some of the most in some of the most beautiful areas with incredible fish. For the first time I'd ever worked with whale sharks. So working with Michael's lab and his students, I got to do a bunch of that work. And so part of my talk will be promoting more of that work, perhaps in the future. But there's great potential in the Red Sea. There's so little known about the shark populations here that I think KAUST is well poised to fill that void.
Good. We have another one over here. Yeah.
So we've learned a lot about sharks when we got involved with molecular biology, but how about the microbiological level? How big are the research involving microbiology in understanding shark behavior or shark biology science?
I think that's that's an area that more work needs to be done. I'm trying to think of who's doing shark microbiology now. Now, granted, I don't do that work, and I don't even know if I don't sample for anybody doing that work. So I think that's a very productive area, field worthy of exploring, and one that not a lot has been published on, particularly when you talk about the diversity of these animals and the diversity of areas around the world where they exist, and specific microbiology is associated with those areas. So I think that would be a wonderful area to go, a road to go down.
Excellent. Any other questions? That's it. All right. Well, thank you. So you're speaking at 12:30, and
I am.
We
I
look
am.
forward to that, and best of luck with that, and enjoy
Thank
the
you.
rest of your time at KAUST.
I love visiting here, and I'm sad I have to leave in the morning, but if all goes well, I'll be back.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Yeah.
My pleasure.
And that's all the time we have for today. Join us tomorrow at 10 a.m. as we speak with Catherine McFadden. She's a professor of biology at Harvey Mudd College. Remember to comment, like, and share on all the KAUST social channels, and from everyone here at KAUST, thanks for joining us.